Hi,
Oh,
Amelia.
hello.
How are you going?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm in lockdown, but I'm still working, so not too bad. What about you?
That's good. I'm in lockdown, bored,
Yeah, yeah.
doing uni.
True. Oh, yeah, you started, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Nice. Fun.
So thanks for joining me for the Artist Alice and Awareness.
That's all right. Happy to be here.
So can you tell me a bit about the poetry that you did for, I mean, they were technically you already wrote those,
Yeah.
but you provided them.
Yes. Well, I wrote them ages ago. So the first one that we posted was Plastic Me, which I wrote in late high school.
Yeah.
And then the second one is called Blaze, and that was more recent. I wrote that one in 2019 or 2020. I always forget when I wrote that one because that was for my current partner, and I can't remember if I gave it to him for his birthday, for an anniversary, for Valentine's Day. I can't really remember. But basically, both are, I mean, like, yeah, very personal poems. I always write poetry from a very personal perspective, and they're always quite emotional and about, more heavy topics, specifically Plastic Me, which is about, depression and anxiety and stuff that I dealt with in high school. So that one's quite heavy and intense,
Yeah.
but that's just where my passion like lies, my motivation for writing. It's often when I'm going through either like difficult things or just really like emotionally intense stuff.
Yeah.
um but that also makes it hard to motivate me to write poetry, because if I'm pretty like chill and stable like I am at the moment, I don't really write much, so I haven't written a poem in a long time.
Yeah. So it's kind of
Yeah,
similar to people who do a lot of songwriting, is like they have to be in a particular headspace to kind of
yeah.
find the words and find those emotions. Because do you feel like it kind of sounds forced if you're in like a really good point in your life and you're trying to like write about something really heavy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, well, yeah, it's like how a lot of people's, like big hit albums are about one particular breakup, because you just get in that like flow of just writing, writing, writing. And then it's more like intense. And I guess like the audience can feel that a bit, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Um, yeah, so I feel like when I try to write when I'm not feeling really heavy emotions, I find it really difficult to be creative as well, which
Yeah.
is a struggle, and it's something I want to be able to like change. And I think it just comes down to like sitting down and trying to write a poem more often. But yeah, that's just something I'm not too good at. Like I really do need that like push for something, whether it's like really intense happy emotions or really intense sad emotions, one or
Yeah.
the other. But yeah, just because I'm in such a stable point in my life at the moment, there's no real push, I
Yeah.
guess.
There's no drive. When you
Yeah.
write poems, do you write them like in a book, or do you type them? Like do you have like one place that you keep them, like, or is it kind of all over the shop? Like you got random pieces of paper flying around?
I mean, weirdly, when I first started writing poetry in early high school, it was all like on paper. Like I just had little notebooks and I'd scribble stuff down. And then once I had like the kind of format that I wanted, or was basically complete, I would transfer that into like my notes on my iPhone.
Okay.
But now I just write it straight in notes. Like I don't know why, it just seems to work better for me. I think like seeing it written as I would look at it, like once it's completed, just like in, I think I also like that notes is like not a Word document. So it's already in like a more narrow format, I guess, if that makes sense. So then
Yeah.
I can separate the lines easier and like see how I would really want it to look.
Yeah.
So that's usually the way I do it. But then once it's completely finished, I put all of them into one Word doc. So I just have one Word doc with all of my poems.
Wow.
And that's like the final spot they go.
Yeah. Do you use, when you write a poem, do you think about the techniques that you want to do before you write it, or do you go back into the poem and put those techniques throughout? Like, how do you?
I mean, my poetry writing is not very technical. It's usually just like a bit of like a word vomit. I just like sit down and I just write. I'm also not one of those people that like writes and then goes back in, edits and edits and edits, and then goes back a little bit later and edits and edits. I write it in like one hit and then I'm like, okay, done. Because I think if I sit and like stew over the words too much, then I start picking out all the things that I don't like. And then I sit there and I'm like, oh, I don't know how to change that. And then I end up just like pushing it aside and
Yeah.
not looking at it again because I just get frustrated with it.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of planning that goes into my writing. I just sort of, whatever happens, happens.
That makes them more genuine. Like, obviously, I feel like songwriters feel the same. Like, they're not going to sit there all the time thinking, well, this technique should be here. It's like, sometimes it just needs to be an emotional word vomit of just, this is how I feel.
Yeah, exactly. And I think by doing that, sometimes like techniques come out without me even realizing it, or, you know, like there's a specific flow that I do in the first two sentences, and then I just naturally like carry that throughout, or something like that. Like the stanzas end up being the same sort of format without me even intentionally trying to do it. It just seems to flow as I'm writing it, if that makes sense. It's not intentional at all. So
yeah. No, for sure. Did you enjoy the poetry that we did in high school? Because obviously that's like a kind of criteria that you do throughout.
Yeah, well, because we did Robert Frost, and I love Robert Frost. He's so good. Especially Tuft of Flowers is one of my faves. I don't know if you remember that. But no, yeah, I did like the poetry we did in high school. I didn't like the analysis as much. Like, I think it was so heavy in analysis, it kind of like bogged down the poems and made them, I don't know, you know, less interesting and artistic. It was so heavy on the techniques.
Do you feel like we didn't focus enough on like the emotional aspects of poetry? Like, would you have preferred there to be more discussions about maybe the emotions that went into it?
I mean, well, because it's hard, because a lot of the poetry that we did in high school was more like, it had a specific purpose. Like, it was trying to explore a specific idea and make connections to, you know, different concepts, that sort of thing. Like, all of Robert Frost's poems were very, comparing two ideas or that sort of thing. Like, none of them were particularly emotional. Like, there was one that was about a relationship like breaking down. But yeah, that one we never went into if that was connected to his own experiences or anything like that. So that probably would have been interesting. I would have liked to see, maybe more perspective from the poem themselves, and like how they got to actually make the poem and what it's based off in their own personal life, if anything. But yeah, it's hard because some poems are just like not really based on anything in their personal life. It's just whatever. So I think like yes and no, depending on the poem. Like, it would have been nice to see some connection to the actual poet themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And then you kind of briefly mentioned that Plastic Me talks about, you know, some of those mental, you know, health problems that you struggle with. Do you feel like that with all the poems that you have, that mental health is kind of something that you kind of delve into your poems, or like those kind of like emotional turmoils? Like, is that kind of something you explore a lot in your poetry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pretty much the only like 2 or 3 poems where I don't really go into that are my recent ones to do with like Dustin, my current partner, because they're much more about just like the relationship, or comparing the positivities in this relationship to past relationships, which is just like a big thing that I notice so much with us. But all my early poems, so spanning from like 2012 to 2019 probably, they were all pretty much mental health. Like, I think there were a few that were just really random, and there was no specific idea. I was just like exploring a random concept. Like, there was one where I just wrote about like a lady in a river or something. But I think when I read it now, I'm like, oh no, you can still see there's like parts from like my mental health that goes into it as well. So I think in some way they all were a little bit connected to my mental headspace at the time. So yeah.
Now, in terms of the issue that you've kind of brought forward for some awareness, you don't really talk about it in your poetry as such, but can you kind of give me some context as to like where did this passion for, I mean, obviously we all care about human rights. Well, yeah, I would hope we do. But you seem pretty passionate about infringing on those rights and stuff. Can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been pretty passionate about things like, say, like the death penalty. I've never agreed with the death penalty. I always think that's a massive infringement on human rights. Like, I don't think anyone deserves to be like, killed, because in my eyes, that's basically like murder anyway. And just because it's done by the law, I don't think it's right at all. So I think my stance with like nuclear weapons is sort of, just an expansion and like an extreme version of those other things, or even say like the criminality age, like, you know, how they make, I don't know, 10-year-olds, they're able to go to prison for life, like all that sort of stuff. I feel like is also, I don't agree with any of that. So yeah, it's just
and
an expansion.
Extreme torture, I assume, as well.
Oh yeah. Anything like advanced interrogation techniques, like, sorry, no, that's torture. Don't agree with that at all.
Yeah.
And like, I know people try to justify it like it's a means to an ends, or it reduces, or it's like, you know, potentially going to reduce a bigger thing that could happen. But there's also so many cases where that person was completely innocent, you know. So I think it's just never a choice, you know. Like,
and you gotta consider, what does that do to the person who's torturing them as well? Like, it's kind of like this sick double-edged sword of like, you know, who's really getting anything out of this? Like,
yeah, exactly. Like even that podcast that you recommended, the People's Lives. Yeah, there was one where the guy, he was like forced, and he said if he didn't actually do the torture, then he would be what was it, like military prison for life or something like that. So it's like, it's orders and you have to do it, and if you don't, there's awful consequences for the person as well. So there's basically like no choice in it. Like, that's just and everything about it's wrong.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that kind of this idea of like cowardice wrapped up in, you know, military war, all that kind of stuff. So it's awful. So going back on your kind of awareness about nuclear weapons, where did that one specifically come from? Because when you first mentioned it, I was honestly, I was quite surprised. Not that I've never, like, obviously I'm aware that nuclear weapons are bad.
Yeah.
But I guess when you don't, like, look into, like, the, you know, the horrific, you know, things that have happened because of nuclear weapons, you know, as an Australian, you don't really think about these things. Where was kind of like your pinpoint of like, oh my god, this is like horrible?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I know, when I mentioned it to you, we're like, what? I've never heard you mention that. Well, it was also kind of random for me. It was just, I'm such like I'll just, you know, fall down a rabbit hole of just researching things and learning everything I can about it. So I think it started with like, because there's a lot of incidents or, you know, like awful things that have happened that I don't really know that much about. So I think it started with like, I was looking at 9/11 because I was like, I actually don't know that much about what happened, like leading up to it, afterwards, all that sort of stuff. Like, you know, you hear about it, but you don't actually really know the specific details. And so I think from there it led into like Chernobyl, and I like researched all about that. I watched a little bit of the show and, you know, had people like watch people commenting on how accurate the show was and all this sort of stuff. And then from that it turned into specifically like Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the, you know, bombings in World War II, and then from there into just nuclear weapons themselves. So the main thing was researching, you know, the effects of Chernobyl, and then also, the disasters in Japan because of World War II.
Yeah. You've always striked me as someone to like just fall down this like research hole.
Yep. I really do. And it can be like
sometimes
the most
I'll be like, I'll be like, can you explain this thing to me? And you'll just have all these facts about it. I'm like, where? I just went on this like 3-hour like, you know, research bender.
Yeah, I actually do constantly. And sometimes they're so random and so nothing. And it just, I don't know why. I just do it all the time. And it can be like the most random things, just like YouTube. I'll just like find so many clips that are just related and just keep watching until I've just exhausted all the information. And then I'm like, cool, now I'm happy. But it has to get to like that point of, just finding out absolutely everything and watching everything.
Do you find a lot of value in kind of doing a real like deep end dive of just like looking at all the commentary, looking at, you know, this person's opinion, these articles? Do you kind of like getting that broad perspective and then coming up with your own perspective? Or do you ever find that you go in bias and then your opinion changes, or do you kind of go in with no opinion?
I mean, it depends on what the topic is, but like usually it begins with just a little bit of like interest, being like, oh, I actually don't know that much about this, or oh, this is something I've never really like thought about or explored. And then specifically say like YouTube videos, there's always, you know, biased perspective, that sort of thing. And I think I definitely go through, you know, stages of either like agreeing with a person and then seeing something else and being like, oh, actually, let me have like a deeper think about this. But I think ultimately I come to my own conclusions based on what I've like consumed. But I definitely like to watch things that are a whole bunch of different perspectives, like especially interviews. I love watching interviews about, you know, any kind of like awful tragedy, especially like a victim and they're talking, because you can like just seeing how interviewers talk to people, and you can see like people that are really positive and like do an amazing job, and then people who just should not interview. I love seeing that like perspective and how the person reacts and the information that you find out because of that. So I think it really depends on what the topic is.
Yeah, definitely. Can you kind of talk about, because obviously like we can simply say that nuclear weapons are bad, but why are they bad? Can you kind of explain that?
I mean, well, obviously if we look at Japan in World War II and like Nagasaki and Hiroshima, those bombings, I mean, it's not just a bomb, like it's completely different because of the nuclear radiation that comes with it. So even in I think it was Hiroshima, the bomb they dropped, which is called Little Boy, that bomb, it blasted like a 5-kilometer square radius, and it killed 700,000 people. Oh no, sorry, 70,000 people instantly. So just from that initial bombing, that many people died. And I had no idea like the numbers at all until I started researching it. So that was just from the initial bomb blast, but then across the next like 4 to 6 months, a further, I mean, it's estimated between like 90,000 people to like 140,000 people. They don't know the exact numbers because those people would have died from the radiation poisoning. So that could manifest as acute like radiation sickness or to like tumors and cancers. So there's no way of really, you know, identifying if it was specifically from the bombings or if it was from just, you know, like genetics, that sort of thing. But so I think the really important thing to think about with nuclear weapons is that it's not just the initial devastating damage, it's the long-term effects. So I researched, and there was one thing that people brought up that, like, say if there was 100 nuclear weapons that were used and like set off in like major cities across the world. So I don't know, like one in Paris, one in Sydney, one in, you know, Tokyo, like everywhere across the world, just 100 of them, it could affect the atmosphere so badly that the like our growing seasons in the world would be shortened, and we'd basically like have a nuclear winter, which would mean massive food supply shortages, and that could, you know, basically make worldwide famine. So it's not just a bomb goes off, a lot of people die instantly. It's also the long-term damages, not only to people, but also the environment, which will then affect everyone. So I think like how you were saying, in Australia, you don't really think about it that much because you're like, oh, we're kind of like removed. And like the likeliness of, I don't know, us being involved in like nuclear war, or, you know, we don't have nuclear weapons in Australia, but we are allied to the US, who has nuclear weapons. And one thing that I found out that I'm really sad about is that Australia has not signed or ratified this treaty to abolish nuclear weapons, but 100 other countries have. And the reason why Australia hasn't is because they think they feel safer because they're allied with the US, who has the nuclear weapons. And I'm like, that is so problematic on so many levels. So I think people really need to think about the fact that just because we're not in either a place that has nuclear weapons or is, you know, in an immediate area or anything like that, like you're still 100% going to be affected by potentially a nuclear war or the use of nuclear weapons. Like it's not just a country by country issue, it's worldwide.
We're still complicit by, you know, being allies with a country that, you know, is pretty open that they have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, exactly. And also I think people that like live in countries that have nuclear weapons think they're safe, and I'm like, I think you're arguably more unsafe than other countries, because then the countries that also have nuclear weapons will retaliate with their own nuclear weapons. You know what I mean? Like it's just doesn't matter where you are, you're not safe from nuclear war, really.
Because how much do you know about the effects of what radiation does to the human body?
I mean, I know a little bit, but also the thing is, it really depends on how much you're exposed to it. So say like there's one really good video that explains exactly how like say if you dropped one nuclear bomb on a city, how it would affect the city and all the people outside of the blast radius, because there's usually like you know, the actual radiation itself travels a really far distance too. So those people outside of the main radius will also get infected by it.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I think it's, I forget how to pronounce the name. It's like Kyrgyzstan or something like that. I'll send it to you and you can show everyone. But
yeah, we'll be linking all the resources that Amelia has used in the description as well.
Yeah, but I highly recommend that video. It's like explains everything really well. But yeah, so initially, if you're exposed to a little bit of radiation, you can get something that's called acute radiation sickness, which isn't like, it's not, you know, terminal, it won't kill you, but it is still an awful thing to get because you get nausea, you get vomiting, you can get like burns on your skin, all this sort of stuff. So even just being exposed to radiation a little bit can have really bad effects on the human body. But over a long period of time, or if you're exposed to more of it, it can lead to death and even developing things like cancers and tumors and that sort of thing. Yeah.
And so also not even the human damage, but the environmental damage that a nuclear weapon can do, it can make it basically unlivable because how do you grow things?
Yeah, I mean, it basically kills everything. And well, in that main like 5-kilometer square radius, it's like destroys everything. So you'll see, there's also another good resource that we'll be linking that shows the before and after images of Hiroshima. And you can see that the entire landscape is just completely totaled. So buildings, trees, like everything is gone. Like it just destroys everything in its path. So yeah, that's the thing. It could take like, you know, thousands of years for any form of nature to actually grow again in that spot. So it can have, you know, super long-term lasting effects. And that's why if there was like a nuclear war, specifically in areas where, say, we would like, you know, grow crops and that sort of thing, then all of that would be destroyed for who knows how long.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's very interesting and something to definitely be aware of, because especially that thing that you mentioned by Australia not signing that treaty, it's like, you know, it's so important to like bring awareness to these things. You may not be a expert in nuclear weapons, but you brought up this conversation that I just was like, this is just so fascinating, because like we don't talk about it enough, and I definitely don't feel like we talk about it enough in Australia. Especially, you know, maybe as young people as well, we don't really discuss, you know, these types of topics. So I definitely think it's important to bring up. Kind of bring full circle back to the start. You are currently studying to be like a teacher and teaching young people like year 2, year 3?
Primary school.
What younger?
Yeah.
When you think about teaching and stuff, do you kind of get excited to teach stuff about topics like this? Like, is there kind of this like eagerness to like do research and be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to teach my students things?
I mean, okay, to be honest,
maybe not about nuclear weapons.
I was going to say, because I'm doing primary school and I don't think you go into nuclear weaponry.
You don't want to freak the parents out.
No, like I'm just having it like a kindy class where I'm talking to them about nuclear bombs. No. I have to look at the like proper curriculum for the older years. I don't think you go into war until high school, like year 7, year 8 when you do history. I think there's like a few mentions of it and that sort of thing, but I don't think you really go into it. So I'm not really eager to teach about nuclear weapons.
Bunch of preschool.
But no, I think I definitely think like if there was a specific topic that the kids were really interested in, I would love to like go home and do a bunch of research and, you know, find a bunch of resources and books and whatever and bring them in and teach the class, all that sort of thing. Like, I think that would be really fun. Like even specifically like current world issues, like say if I was a teacher now and I was teaching one of the older years, like 5 or 6 or something, and the kids were like, oh, we want to know more about like say COVID, I would love to just get like a bunch of resources and teach them all about it and, you know, compare to other diseases and all this sort of stuff. Like I think that would be so much fun. So I would I'm definitely excited to do things like that. So I think it just depends on what the topic is, not nuclear weapons but other things. For sure.
Start them young. Out.
I just like brainwash them all to just sign the petition.
Yeah, that would probably go against a few ethical procedures with the school. But
No
it
doubt.
it makes a lot of sense that you're going into teaching, and like you have that ability to kind of like understand things and then show
Pass it
someone
on.
how to do it, teach someone.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, you just did it. You just did it for me, and hopefully a few other people.
There you go. I mean, it'll be very different with a class of 30 kids, you know, but
Yes.
I am excited to do that.
Yeah. And then just one more question. When it comes to your poetry,
mm-hmm.
obviously your poetry is very personal. And I think obviously, I mean, I always bring it back to songwriting because there's a lot of like connectedness there. A lot of, musicians, maybe sometimes they want to delve into like, topics that don't necessarily affect them, or it's something about someone else, or even go political. When you do your poetry, have you ever thought about kind of challenging yourself to go like beyond you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have a little bit, but a lot of the time it does come back to me in some way. I think every time I've tried to do like write poems that are a little bit less personal and are about like a broader topic or something, I find it like difficult to actually, I don't know, like form what the idea is and actually like make it come across in a way that's understandable, because I just find it easier to like actually form an idea when it's based on myself. So I think that's just something I have to, practice more, experience, that sort of thing. Like I'd love to be able to do that. Like it's going back to Robert Frost, like a lot of his poems just aren't personal at all, but like beautiful. And I would love to be able to write just about, like a tuft of flowers and like a garden, something like that, and make it interesting in a way that I can do with personal things. But I think that's just like a slow going process that I'll hopefully be able to develop. So
yeah, for sure. Well, that was a lovely chat. Thank you.
Yeah. No worries.
Yeah. What are your charities that you have found?
So the big one is a petition that I want everyone to join. It's an international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So I don't think they should exist at all. And this petition agrees. So it's basically like a coalition of non-government organizations, and they're in like 100 countries across the world. So just sign that petition because that can really help. And then the other thing is the International Committee for the Red Cross. They do a lot of like really great work just globally in general, but specifically with nuclear weapons, they do help a lot of victims of nuclear war and that sort of thing. So if you can donate to them, that would also be really good.
Yeah. And I mean, amazingly, with Acid Lake, we have got a design for your shirt.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, and all the profits will go to the selected charity for that as well. So
beautiful.
It's a great full circle, really, bringing awareness to this and selling some great shirts.
Even though it's not connected to my poetry at all, but we'll just ignore that.
I mean, but again, it doesn't matter. I think, not every artist is gonna, not every artist and their art is gonna necessarily relate to an issue that they, would like to bring awareness to. But it's more important to show that just because you're a creative person, there's not just one thing. Like you're a multifaceted person. You want to teach, you want to, you're passionate about, infringing on human rights. Like
it's true.
A lot of the time creative people are put in this box of like, you go in a cave, you create something, and that's it. Blood, sweat, and tears. You can't do anything else. There's there's this absolute restriction that someone who can create great art is anything more than their art at the end of the day. And I think it's important to like kind of, take the opportunity where you can, where it's like if you've got all these artists who have, passions for other things, then that should be spoken about.
Yeah, absolutely.
The amount of positive work that can come out of it is really good.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, great chat, and time.
Yeah, thank you. See ya.